All right. It is the week of March 13th, 2023, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and we are back, ladies and gentlemen. COVID kicked my ass for a little bit, but I am back. Not quite 100%, but still here. We'll hopefully get better in the next coming weeks, and we should be good to go back to a normal swing of things, get those side projects I've been talking about up and running. We did reschedule them. They should be coming down the pipe. With that being said, while I was gone, a lot of important things happened and a few we have to discuss today, starting with Jon Jones beating Ciryl Gane for the vacant UFC heavyweight championship. Is it best for business that Jon Jones is now the quote unquote baddest man on the planet for the UFC as compared to Ngannou? Right? Ngannou walked away, wanted a better deal, wanted some other things besides just money, and was universally recognized as the biggest, baddest heavyweight MMA fighter. Now you have Jones win the vacant belt, which would have been better in an ideal scenario. That's what we're going to look at from both the UFC's perspective as well as the fan perspective. It's particularly interesting because Jones never beat Ngannou, right? So lots to unpack there. Then we're going to talk about Endeavor's Q4 earnings and full year 2022 earnings. A ton of information that's just a gold mine for business nerds like me, and probably if you're watching this, very good information about their finances. Very interesting notes that Endeavor themselves wrote about the 2023 outlook, including perceived risks that affect the UFC in particular, and just a ton of stuff we got to go through. So we will cover that. Then we're going to do a quick hit section. And last but not least, we are going to talk about recent comments made by Ari Emanuel, CEO of Endeavor, regarding the UFC ESPN deal, as well as CEO of Disney, Bob Iger's comments regarding how ESPN fits into the Disney portfolio. They are connected, the comments are, and I particularly think it's going to have a major impact for the UFC, given where, from a corporate strategy standpoint, both entities seem to be going. So timestamps at the bottom as always, and let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so first thing we're going to talk about on today's show is Jon Jones coming back and just dominating Ciryl Gane for the vacant UFC heavyweight champion, right? There was a lot of fan and media speculation in terms of who was going to win this fight, and would it really matter because Ngannou was still, known as the baddest man on the planet in MMA, right? All this kind of swirling, what's going to happen? And Jones goes in and puts on pretty much the best performance he could, outside of just going in and absolutely like highlight reel knockout type thing against Gane. Instead, he drags Gane down, submits him very easily over in the first round. I mean, Jones looked fantastic at heavyweight. And that's a huge deal for a lot of reasons, right? If you were the UFC when Ngannou walked away, it wasn't the end of the world. We know that he wasn't a known pay-per-view mover, right? He did have a lot of hype behind him amongst the hardcore fans. He did have some international pull, was gaining some steam, but he never really recovered from that first loss to Stipe in terms of crossover potential. Doesn't mean he couldn't have, kept racking up wins and become this new, baddest man on the planet thing and really become a superstar. It's always possible, but he wasn't there yet when he walked away, right? But he was still at least garnering interest from Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder, Anthony Joshua for boxing. I mean, he's still right now as a free agent. Anytime a promotion is like, we're having serious talks with him, all this, it's news in the media space of MMA, right? So it's still a bigger face. It's not somebody that's like, oh, here is this champion who was boring or barely fought or, had some pull, but no, he's going somewhere else. Great. No, this was one of the bigger champions on the UFC roster at the time. And him walking away was not great from the UFC's perspective for many reasons, especially given the interviews where he talked about it wasn't just money. He wanted certain fighter rights, healthcare, all this other stuff. It just shined a pretty big spotlight on some glaring holes and criticisms in the UFC's treatment of fighters. And the expectation, at least for some media and fans, was this is the first of many, right? Ngannou is one of the bigger stars of the company right now. He's going to walk away, go somewhere else. Others are going to follow. They're going to see it's not worth it, especially with, people going out and making way more money boxing YouTubers than they were fighting at. Makes sense that this was kind of a shift or perceived shift for a lot of media and fans. But then Jon Jones goes in and does what he does at UFC 285. And you could see, at least among the fans, it was like a light switch, right? Just done. Everybody's talking about how Jones is the GOAT. He's a 2 weight class champion now. He just absolutely demolished the, probably best current heavyweight in the division right now, and the guy that gave Ngannou a lot of trouble. And yes, Ngannou had the knee issues, which speaks a lot to his performance that night. But, MMA fans have kind of a goldfish memory when it comes to that stuff, right? Think about how many times a close split decision win has drastically changed the trajectory of a fighter's career, and then it's rarely brought up again. It's like, well, he beat him and him and him. It's like, yeah, but did you see that fight where maybe the judges got it wrong? It's fans don't really think about that stuff a lot. They look at just, did they win or did they lose? If it's a bad enough robbery, okay, then it's 6th round, right? A la Hendricks versus GSP, or, a couple of these other fights. Yeah, sure. It definitely hangs around. But for the most part, it's overlooked. And especially Ngannou was fighting basically without legs during that fight. And he still managed to wrestle and do all of that. It was very impressive given his injuries. But in a lot of fans' minds, they saw him barely get away with a decision, whereas Jones came in against the same opponent and finished him in 2.5 minutes or whatever it was. From the UFC's perspective, who would have been better as champion, right? Ngannou staying or Jones coming in doing what he did? To me, it's unequivocally Jones coming in and doing what he did. Jones easily just, again, making that light bulb switch for fans is everything the UFC wanted. It gets the light off of their treatment of fighters. It gets the, focus more on, here's the GOAT. Jon Jones is back. He's been away for 3 years. He comes back and he does that. He's going to run through everybody in the heavyweight division. It totally changed the narrative. And yes, you still have some people talking about Ngannou, but not nearly in the same way as they did before, right? You have a couple media saying, like, remember, like, the real baddest man on the planet, which is, there's definitely an argument there, yes, but the majority of the fans and the perception has now completely shifted. This is a classic UFC tactic that they've been doing as fighters have left over and over. Sometimes it's easier for them to pull off. Other times it's not so much. In this case, about everything went as right as it possibly could for the UFC in terms of Jon Jones coming back and doing what he did. Especially because we know Jones can pull certain pay-per-view numbers, right? If it's a good rivalry, if it's a good matchup, Daniel Cormier, I mean, his rematch was 800K pay-per-view buys. I mean, he can pull numbers. Need the right opponent, need a bit of a buildup, but there's enough interest and hype he can. And especially given what he just did, my guess is some fans that have kind of tuned out and forgotten about Jones are going to come back and watch his next couple of fights. Right? It makes sense. So from the UFC's perspective, this is about as good as it gets. You are able to put the former heavyweight champ in your rearview mirror, focus on a new champ that you can call the GOAT and who has a legitimate argument for being the GOAT. I mean, outside of the PED stuff, but depending on how you judge greatest of all time, he's definitely in the conversation. There's no denying that. And they don't have to worry about any blowback from letting Ngannou go anymore. It's gone. It's was in the news cycle. It's gone now. And Ngannou, again, still pulling in headlines if he's having serious talks with different promotions, all that, but it's not anywhere near the same as it was, 2 or 3 months ago. Not even close. And that's huge. That's huge for the promotion. And again, if they could ideally pick which champion they'd want, they'd probably want Jones. They probably would have preferred him to beat Ngannou, right? But Ngannou was never going to, be easy to work with contract-wise. And Jones is already established as a huge name in the sport that has crossover potential, and especially in the older fan base, people will remember him. Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense that you'd ideally want Jones to beat Ngannou, become the new champ, get all this hype. They didn't get exactly that, but they did get him running through Ngannou's last opponent like it was nothing. And now they can push the narrative like, oh, which Dana has, right? Oh, Gane would have won that fight if he had just not gone for the submission thing, blah, 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 against Ngannou. And now you have Jones come in and do that. I mean, he's the GOAT. There you go. That's all it takes. That's all it takes. It's by far best for business for the UFC. And the fans, again, have adopted it very readily. So I'm sure Ngannou will still go out and do his thing, but his, star power and negotiating power probably got hit a little bit based on what happened. And, Dana saying Ngannou's never coming back, which is probably true because, when you see Dana put a vendetta out against someone like that, it's usually how it goes. And Ngannou even agreed in some comments. So now it's up to Ngannou to go do his own thing, right? And he can come back. He can make splashy waves. He can do his thing. Of course. He can get that momentum back, that leverage back. But right now, it's all smiles for the UFC. The only interesting tidbit here where I'm scratching my head a little bit from the UFC's perspective, right, is doing Stipe versus Jones makes sense on paper. But from a business perspective, you are taking a little bit of a risk again. Because if Jones gets through Miocic, right, then great. Now you have even more ammo to say, like, hey, the guy that wrestled Ngannou the first time and we never saw the trilogy and all that, like, I mean, Jones runs through him. Okay. But if Stipe ends up winning that fight, especially in dramatic fashion, it definitely opens up the door to be like, oh, well, Ngannou knocked Stipe out pretty easily. I really wonder how Ngannou versus Jones would have gone. And kind of opens the door a little bit there where if Ngannou goes and makes big waves, I mean, you're going to have more focus on it again, right? So that's a little bit curious. But then again, there's not a lot of other opponents for Jones, and that's a fight Jones has wanted. And, Stipe is on paper and Jones has even said the greatest heavyweight of all time in the UFC. I mean, makes a lot of sense. So little bit of a head scratcher there from a business perspective, but I guess, I mean, UFC's never been one to not take risks, and the door is still mostly shut. It's not going to like be blown wide open if Stipe lands a, big knockout punch or anything. So we'll see how that goes. But from a business perspective, Jones winning, couldn't be more happier if you're the UFC. All right. Next up, we have to talk about Endeavor's Q4 2022 and more importantly, full year 2022 financial year filings. So Endeavor had their Q4 earnings call and their full year earnings call a little while back, and it was the fourth best financial year in a row for the company. So for the past 4 years, hey, best financial year. Just so they've just been killing it over the past 4 years, right? Which we know. We've talked about multiple times, but they've done it again in 2022, where 2022 with the pay-per-view buy dip that Sports Business Journal reported on last May, you kind of wondered, well, maybe they'll do really well, but will they actually break that record again? Well, they did it again, folks. Can't be that surprised, but yeah. The UFC, obviously a huge part of that, makes up most of their own sports properties filing. So if you look at that, they have PBR, a Euro Basketball League. They had some minor baseball league teams that are gone now. But yeah, it's pretty much the UFC makes up the majority of that. We don't know the exact percentage, but most of the money, and is, again, the crown jewel for Endeavor's portfolio. It's what's allowing them to pay down $500 million in debt as a discretionary payment, which they did, to bring debt down to $5.17 billion instead of 5.6, which, with the way interest rates have gone and the way they continue to rise, that's good, because we know that 40% of that 5.6 was variable. Now, after the $500 million payment, we don't know the exact percentage, but it's still going to be around there, right? Where as interest rates go up, their interest payments go up for nearly half of that. So it's important for them to be able to do that. And most of that money, again, is being generated by the UFC. This past year, again, sponsorship for the UFC was the highest sales in company. We talked about that throughout the year, where they have been going hard on partnerships and sponsorships. I mean, Battle Motors and Prime hydration corners and all this stuff, where every part of the octagon has something on it now. You got the clock with DraftKings, all this stuff. It's been a huge year for them. They also talked about the renewal of the international media rights, which we've covered on this podcast multiple times. They've been going and doing these deals internationally, getting near double what they originally had in media rights once the new deal is signed. It's huge for them. They also, put out here, most notably, sales were great in the NFT and trading card type industry. So not surprising that the past couple of years have been just pumping NFTs. The UFC NFTs were like $50 a piece or something for a pack, or so, much higher than NBA Top Shot pick NFTs. I forget what they were selling at exactly, but I think around $50 for a pack, which is just wild, right? So again, not shocking that they've got all that. They've got new, crypto sponsors, obviously, with Crypto.com. Those are not doing so well right now, and we'll see what that looks like in 2023. But for 2022, a lot of money came in for all that stuff. And it's not shocking that they were able to pull off their best financial year ever, pretty much hugely in part because of the UFC. We don't know, again, the exact amount of money that they brought in. John Nash did a report on this. He does a great job breaking down the numbers and doing some good estimates of what they are. We do know, direct operating costs for owned sports properties were up about 14% from 2021, but it's offset largely by the amount of money that they were able to bring in, right? So it's to cut through a lot of it, it's a ton of new sponsorships, a ton of new deals. We're able to just boost revenue for the owned sports properties up to $1.332 billion. Again, we don't know the exact amount that the UFC is bringing in, but according to Nash, I believe he had 1.15 billion or something like that, and that sounds about right. I would agree with his assessment based on the filing and the financials. So to focus a little bit on what riled people up the most with some of this, right, which was the lower athlete cost is helping to offset some of this stuff. We've known, if you've been following this podcast, we've known that athlete costs were going to be lower in 2022. The amount of Dana White Contender Series signings, look at these Fight Night cards and how many people are either Dana White Contender Series or Ultimate Fighter. And then based on the fact that those contracts are particularly longer and pay lower, right? Like 10K, we knew that athlete costs were going down. They were cutting more and more established fighters who were outside the top 15 or even within the top 15, but didn't want to gatekeep, right? And instead bringing on people from Contender Series or the Ultimate Fighter at just ridiculously low rates, right? These aren't former LFA or Titan FC or Cage Warriors champions that are getting called up. We've got some of those, but the majority are people on the regional scene who have pretty good records and, again, could be good, but we don't really know. Seem like a good prospect, or at least kind of a good prospect. Come in, win a fight, and then if Dana likes him, gives him a contract. But again, it's partially if Dana likes them, and also you could just tell by some of these episodes where all the fighters are getting contracts. If you won, you got a contract, because this is a way to become the feeder league into the UFC and cut out the middleman. And mind you, Dana White Contender Series is a separate company from the UFC, right? So Dana's probably making more money from that than he would, it's technically probably like a subsidiary that he owns and runs, and he's getting, cuts of that when the fighter gets called up. I'm sure there's certain deals being worked out, right? It makes a ton of sense. The UFC cut out the middleman of the feeder league, vertical integration. We're going to go all the way to the prospects. In some ways, they are trying to go even a step further in that, right? And I say in some ways, but in a lot of ways, actually. That's part of the UFC PI. It's part of the UFC Combine, right? That they ran in, I believe, in Shanghai to find fighters and road to UFC, right? Tournaments. They are trying to go so far as to bring in the athletes and, okay, we're going to bring them in. I mean, you've got an NIL deal in Iowa, right? Like, bring in some of these athletes right off the bat, train them, and then they get a Contender Series fight or they get a UFC fight, but they're brought in under that whole structure. It makes a lot of sense. Why be just the feeder league when you can also be the training ground where the fighter has to pay for your facilities and your coaches and, right? How can you get more money out of fighters? That's a way to do it. And keeps your costs down, right? We know that according to Endeavor, part of the increase in operating costs were offset by lower athlete costs. Yes, of course. It's only going to get worse, right? I expect you're going to see more and more Contender Series people getting called up, or Ultimate Fighter people getting called up, especially from the McGregor Chandler season coming up. And then from there, they get locked into these contracts and they stay. We're going to get to a point, I can almost guarantee you, we're going to get to a point in 5-10 years where every card is Dana White Contender Series alum / Ultimate Fighter alum. Save a couple of people, right? A couple of younger stars that are almost certainly going to stick around, sure. But at least 90% of the cards are going to be all Dana White Contender Series people. It always made sense to do this. It's also why I've seen a lot of people be like, you gotta, do more fights like they did Jan versus Merab at the theater, right? Instead of the Apex. And everybody's like, man, it's just a different feel. It's just so much better. It's cool. Don't get me wrong. If I was going to go to a fight night in Vegas, I'd prefer to go to a style of Jan versus Merab, but the UFC has to pay to use that venue. And then you got to move production costs, all that fun stuff. Whereas Apex is all in-house. Those Apex cards aren't going away. There's no way. There are far too many obligated fight nights. It makes way too much sense to cram those fight nights with 1 or 2 known fighters in your headliner, and then the rest with Dana White Contender Series people, and then you do it at the Apex, and it costs almost nothing. And then you're able to do a big card like International Fight Week, which they're talking about doing. Right, they're talking about doing 2 or 3 title fights for that and making it a huge thing. Sure, that's the big card of the year. You can afford to do that when you've done a ton of low-cost, crappy fight night cards, because in the end, the costs overall are still lower. And that's the game. Now, in terms of the outlook and some of the risks that Endeavor calls out, there's a whole risk section in their filing. I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of them are like, we rely on business systems, and technology. Well, yeah. And we rely on certain regulations. Yes. Also, yes. Those are the type of risks that are always going to be there that are just kind of boilerplate put in a lot of company filings. But 2 that were put out there that I want to bring up are, first of all, one focused on the overall macroeconomic environment. They brought up rising interest rates, that they are at the whim of consumer spending, right? that as the macro environment dampens, their products are highly sensitive to consumers' spending amounts. So your customer, right? Your target customer is always going to be on a scale of, I guess you do dull to highly sensitive, 0 to 100. I've seen a million different types of scales that people use, but generally, right, there's a heat chart that talks about here's a customer or target customer audience, and how sensitive are they to certain variable factors, right? If I change this slight thing, does it make my audience go way up or down? Whereas maybe a different target audience, I change a slight thing and it barely moves at all. And it's just not hypersensitive to that particular change. And that's with any product or service, right? Whenever you're trying to dive into your target market, your target customer, you have to do, usually do a SWOT analysis if it's a brand new market, and then you usually do a scorecard, balanced scorecard to look at, okay, let me put everything out there. What am I going to do with this particular product or service? And in particular changes, how sensitive are they to a government change? Am I, do a SWOT analysis, all that fun stuff. But again, a big thing in this filing is Endeavor essentially admitting that we need people to have extra cash. And if they lose that extra cash, it could very, adversely affect our business. Whereas if, okay, I'm doing well, the economy's doing well, I have extra spending money, sure, I'm going to throw down $80 for a pay-per-view. Oh, that's a lot of money. Sure, but I've got the money. I love fights. Great. Economy is not doing so well. Things are kind of dampening. Maybe I've lost my job, or my bills are going up, or something's happening. Well, now I've got less money to spend. I'm not going to throw $80 for a pay-per-view. I'm not going to pay X amount per month for ESPN Plus. I got to cut it because I lost my job, or my industry is in trouble, or my business is struggling. Million different reasons, right? But they're very sensitive, and they acknowledge this. They are highly sensitive to free cash flow of their customers. That's important as we get into 2023. We've seen interest rates continue to rise. We've seen tech layoffs. We've seen a couple banks fail now for kind of hilarious reasons. Hilarious and sad, but still, it seems like that environment is starting to manifest, right? This recession that everybody's been talking about, economists have been talking about. They say something like 82% of all economists right now say that a recession is coming within 6 months, but no one ever is good at saying like, oh, here's the recession, right? And that's up quite a bit from several other theories and estimates just 6 months to a year ago. And that could change, right? Things could change, and all of a sudden, recession doesn't happen. Economists do their best to predict this, but you never know. But certain things are certainly signaling some worry in the market, and thus the overall macro environment. Especially, the tech sector is being hammered. Crypto still being hammered. Banks are now being hammered because of Silicon Valley Bank. It is maybe nothing, maybe a blip. It might be the start of something. But either way, as regular people, right, become cash strapped, Endeavor's aware that they are one of the first on the chopping block. So that's a risk they're going to have to navigate. The fact they're aware of it and they're calling it out so highly, I think that's probably a good thing. And they've got some ideas there, but it's going to be interesting to see how the UFC adapts to that in particular, because those $80 pay-per-views are a lot. And as we've talked about, it's probably more of a Disney decision than a UFC one. But if they're not getting the movement they want and they're unhappy when the media rights deal comes up, well, trouble, which we'll talk about in a little bit of a later segment, right? The other risk that we need to talk about that was brought up is tied into that a little bit, in that they specifically call out their distribution line. They're highly dependent on their distribution deals and partnerships. They specifically mention in the risks their deal with ESPN and international broadcast pay-per-view deals, and how certain changes to those deals could grossly affect the business. Which, if pay-per-views stop selling and Disney says, you know what, I don't want to pay even as much as I paid last time for these rights, that's a big problem for Endeavor in the UFC. They are aware of how much of their lifeline, the fact that they're calling out UFC pay-per-views in particular, and that deal saying ESPN is a crucial partner, that right there is a corporate big circle around, hey, this is a critical deal for our company to survive and thrive. This deal is number one, right? And the rest of the risks you don't see, like, they don't mention any other broadcaster by name. They don't mention other particular, sports-owned property broadcast deals or other partnerships with Endeavor. No, UFC and ESPN's deal is called out pretty much point blank right there, which is a corporate way of saying, like, hey, this is massively important. If something goes wrong with this, we're in trouble. So again, the fact they're calling it out and they're aware of it is good, but it will be interesting to see how renewal rights go, which we're going to talk about based on Ari and Iger's comments here in a little bit. Other than that, again, some good info here in terms of the actual numbers. You can download the filing, the company's filing, for free. You can also download a transcript of the earnings call for free if you want to. Just search Endeavor Q4 2022 earnings call or SEC filing, and you'll get all that info. Again, Jon did a great job writing up, as he always does, something regarding some of the key highlights. If you don't want to sift through it all, but definitely encourage you to take a look. It shows an interesting picture, especially if you paint it next to the previous years. They've just been going up and up and up. That type of trajectory is very hard to maintain. And the money flow is kind of the faucet of free money is turning off. It's been turning off most of 2022, but now it's moving a little bit faster. Going to be very interesting to see where things go next year, especially because the stock is still, hovering around, at I think of this recording, $21-22 a share. So it's not like it went way up. It's kind of around where the IPO was. That's also interesting. It's not been doing well. I mean, a lot of stocks haven't recently, but we'll see. We'll see where this all goes, because Endeavor's debt is still there. It's getting paid down, but it's still very much there, and things are kind of getting darker. Let me know if you have any questions on this stuff. If you want me to cover any particulars, I'm happy to bring this subject up again or talk about other parts of, I could even go into calculations if you want. But let me know, because to me, this stuff, I could sit here reading these reports all day and looking at the company's filings and analysis. Curious to see what you guys think. All right. For quick hits, just a couple of things I want to touch on that I thought were particularly interesting. Proper 12 Irish Whiskey is going to be the official whiskey partner of PFL Europe. That's an interesting one, just because, again, that is Conor McGregor's brand. Conor McGregor is synonymous with the UFC, but McGregor did sell most of his stake in Proper 12. He still has some, but he's not the sole owner as he once was, or the majority shareholder. So it's not that shocking to see it move, but it's a smart move by PFL because, again, you get McGregor's name attached to the brand. It's a well-known brand in the MMA space. It's another sponsorship for you, which they've been racking up and doing a great job of building that portfolio. It's a good get. I think it makes a lot of sense. You add in the fact they just recently signed Dan Hardy to be on the PFL. I forget, director of something in Europe. It's a good way, again, to target in on the hardcore MMA audience who are familiar with these things. That might, I'm seeing these fighters going over the PFL that I saw in the UFC. I know Proper 12, now Dan Hardy, okay, and kind of chipping away at that hardcore audience, which is what the PFL wants to do, right? They'd love to get the casual audience, but a huge part of their target market is the hardcore. I'm a UFC diehard fan. I'm watching every day. They want to get more and more of those to become, I watch UFC, and when UFC is not on, I watch PFL because it's great, and get enough of that to keep building more momentum, to build more partnerships, more opportunity, and actually going to the black. So I think it's a good call. Again, PFL has impressed me quite a bit with what they've been able to achieve in sponsorships lately, and what they've been able to um, pull off from a business perspective, especially given some of the roadblocks they faced earlier on. So yeah, it is impressive, and we will see what happens there. Next up, we have to talk about UFC and TikTok extending their global live partnership. Partnership began in 2021. There's a blurb here from the global head of sports and gaming at TikTok, Harish Sarma, that says, quote, "The UFC has built an incredible following community on TikTok by providing fans with unique behind-the-scenes access to their athletes and events. By expanding our partnership, we're excited to continue bringing our global community, especially the mixed martial arts community, closer to the action and excitement of the UFC." Since joining the platform in 2019, UFC amassed more than 2.6 billion views on its flagship channel, and videos across all accounts accumulated over 4.7 billion views. Not surprising. Again, a huge shift that's been happening on the UFC side, right, is pushing social media metrics, and even you're seeing with pay-per-views kind of locked down behind the ESPN Plus barrier, where it's much harder to get those numbers. This allows the UFC to, follow new metrics, release those metrics, show that they're amassing quite a following, get more partnerships, parlay hey, we got this many views. How about you partner with us to be our beer or our, I don't know, official toothbrush, right? I mean, this just only helps them market themselves more and more for those partnership and sponsorship deals. So big get there. I think the extension on TikTok is great. We'll see about TikTok getting banned in the US. If that happens, I think that'll be a whole nother thing. But for right now, I think it's a solid call. And then lastly, Endeavor is partnering with Women's Sports Foundation and making a $250K donation. So the Women's Sports Foundation announced a new partnership to accelerate gender equality or equity in women's athletics. Partnership includes a $250K donation from Endeavor Impact on behalf of Endeavor and UFC, and will focus on creating pathways for women athletes, coaches, administrators, and executives to enter and succeed at the highest levels of their industries. It will collaborate on events to assist women athletes in their professional development, collaborate on advocacy efforts, and partnership uniquely combines Endeavor sports organizations, et cetera, et cetera. There's a couple blurbs, but it's all PR, all fluff, and like, hey, we're super happy about this. This is gonna change a lot of stuff. And I mean, again, it's a big donation. It's a big name to partnership with, so that's great for the Women's Sports Foundation. I think this is something you'll continue to see Endeavor do more of in terms of just trying to build equity, particularly with the UFC when certain things come to light, right? We've talked about Ngannou, but then there's also been the power slap stuff. I am not shocked that they've done this. I would expect this could eventually lead back to, certain charitable events that the UFC puts on, maybe during International Fight Week, like they used to, right? Way back in the day where they had a ton of events. Maybe Endeavor does something like that again, with charity 5Ks, things like that. Who knows? But it's, again, corporate PR. You're buying corporate PR with charity. It's what this is. And that's not to say, again, the people that aren't putting this together don't believe in it, and that, Endeavor doesn't believe in it, but this is a classic corporate PR move of, hey, we want to get some goodwill, some faith here. Look at what we're doing in this. Again, it's something to market towards sponsors. And women's, especially the women viewership category between 18 and 49 that is, a coveted market that the UFC doesn't do super well with, right? They don't do poorly necessarily, but obviously, if you've ever been to a UFC event, right, you've got lines for the men's bathroom going everywhere, women's bathroom, not as much. They've been making good strides, though, in getting, more, women viewership. And I think doing stuff like this, doing sponsorships, I think that's kind of their way to break into that target market a little bit more. So, again, makes sense. One quick hit I don't have anything more on, but I may next week is the IMMAF stuff. I know that's probably going to come up with them being in debt, had the director removed, all that stuff. I want to do a little bit more of an in-depth breakdown on that, so I'm going to save that for next week. But let me know if I missed any other quick hits. A little bit longer than I thought, but it happens sometimes. We're going to talk about some comments that Ari Emanuel and Bob Iger have made in regards to ESPN. So first, we're going to start with Ari's comments as they relate a little bit more to the UFC, but then it's going to tie into Iger's comments and kind of paint a whole picture here, I think, of the status of where ESPN is in the larger corporate environment space, but then also what that means for the UFC media rights deal coming up soon. So Ari Emanuel was at a Morgan Stanley Technology, Media, and Telecom Conference, gave some quotes. You can search that Morgan Stanley Technology, Media, and Telecom Conference and find a video of all of his comments. But some things that stuck out in particular is, quote, "We have a great relationship with ESPN, love our relationship with them, and we have a year left until we can start our renewal. I think it's going to be a positive outcome for both parties, but there's a lot of buyers out there." So that's already saying, you know what? Yeah, we love ESPN, but there's some options out there. He goes on to say, if you just look at sports rights, Formula One in the United States, when I think from 5 million to 95 million per year, hockey was 240 million per season. NFL obviously signed a huge deal. He says, well, sorry, the quote is, "You saw what the NFL did." But goes on to say, "We have a pretty good knowledge because we have 150 sports we represent in IMG, where sports rights are are internationally and where they're going domestically. Our Big Ten deal that we just executed, we represented Wimbledon in their renegotiations, so we have a pretty good sense where it's going." So that Big Ten deal was a big one, and they helped, again, negotiate it. And same with Wimbledon. That's a huge piece here, right? It's one thing to have a property that people want, and you go through negotiations and, find your suitor, so to speak. It's another to be in that position, but then also just completely separately, you are representing and helping negotiate clients get and do exactly the same thing, right? So part of their business is to represent Big Ten and Wimbledon and get a media rights deal done for a ton of money. So they're getting a bunch of experience in negotiation there. They're seeing what the appetite is and the market is for those types of rights. And then, they also have rights that they want to go and sell. So they're going to be well prepared, have a good idea of what's going on, have a good feel for the market. It's a very nice situation to be in. Part of the reason, again, Endeavor has created this ecosystem where they have synergies and thrive off of each other. And I know it's a big business word that everybody uses all the time, but this is an example of an actual synergy. Is their division representing a completely separate client trying to get media rights, and then them being able to take those capabilities and that experience and put it towards their own deal, right? That's an example of corporate synergy that isn't just BS, like CEO talk. So with that, one comment I want to end with here is, you have 6 buyers in the marketplace, Emmanuel said. And this is, I'm taking some of these quotes as well from MMA Fighting's article that Damon Martin wrote. "And when we made our first UFC deal, there was one buyer, and the buyer was Bob Iger, actually." Part of the reason we're going to talk about his comments. He's the one that actually brought it over. But then he goes on to say, "I think we've done an amazing job for the growth of ESPN Plus and ESPN, and we have the Contender Series. Now they order the Ultimate Fighter. So in all, it's one of the fastest growing sports out there that's demographic, social, and male/female and age category." The buyer comments, I mean, Well, before that, the Contender Series, all that, yeah, that's great. That's basically, again, communicating to buyers like, hey, we will produce content for you. We will put stuff on your streaming platform. It's not just the fights. We do a whole bunch of stuff. So it helps sell you there. But the comment about 6 buyers versus 1, again, is Ari essentially saying, look, it's a tougher market than it was before, right? And that's directed specifically at Bob Iger. He calls Iger out by name. Iger is now the CEO of Disney again. I mean, it's essentially saying like, look, we want a certain number. We have a great relationship, but you're not the only player in town anymore. And that's a negotiation technique, right? It's putting some of the pressure on Disney and on ESPN saying like, look, we want to get this done, but we have options. And they do. They certainly do, at least right now. But where the market goes, we'll see. With Ari's comments out of the way, let's turn to Bob's, which I think is a little bit more interesting and paints a little bit of a fuller picture of what ESPN and Disney might do when these media rights come up, right? So this is from the Financial Times. The title of this article is Iger is stuck. Disney chief debates future of Hulu and ESPN. And so what it goes on to illuminate, right, is that right now the free money faucet is essentially turned off. You've got people worried more and more about actual profitability with streaming services. No streaming service out there right now is killing it, so to speak, in terms of profits, but you do have profitable services. Hulu, for example, is one with 48 million subscribers. They are a profitable streaming service out there. ESPN Plus, not so much. They're 25 million subscribers, and they're making a lot less money than the type of advertising and revenue they were able to bring in through terrestrial ESPN. But ESPN terrestrial is obviously declining. Financial Times calls out that in 2013, you had 94 million subscribers or watchers to the service, and now it's a little under 73. So, I mean, that's a huge drop. That's almost a 25% drop in, a decade, and it's only going to get worse and only get accelerated, right? So this is an interesting situation for Iger because Disney is also $48 billion in debt. Part of the reason that Bob Chapek got removed, that we've covered a little bit on this program, is he went very aggressive all out trying to grow these streaming platforms. And part of what he did rubbed people the wrong way, but also caused some pretty heavy losses and some not so great financials. And that caused a pullback from investors and board members becoming kind of upset. I mean, you had an activist investor join the board to get Chapek to change his position or removed because shareholders were not happy. And so this led to the Sunday night Disney massacre, massacre, if you want to call it. No, it's terrible. That's a bad joke. But still, the massacre, where, Chapek was ousted, Iger put back in. And Iger's said on the record, he's looking to get out. I don't think he ever wanted to be in this position. I think he liked being, again, in his role, which was kind of an advisor to Chapek and kind of like part of the transition, but he doesn't want to be CEO. I think he took the reins back because he didn't like where Chapek was going with things. Some, red flags started to pop up financially. And part of that was, again, this aggressive move to try and expand streaming. Now you've got Disney with $48 billion in debt and investors and the macro environment changing pretty rapidly with rising interest rates where they want more profitability than they're willing to just take these losses and throw money at things because it'll work out one day. Like that mentality is dying off pretty quick. So if you're Iger, you've got to figure out what you're going to do with Disney properties and how you're going to get things into the black. He made some good changes, right? A part of Disney Q4's earning was some cuts at Disney, some layoffs, but then also some restructuring and what they were, refocus on particular properties. where the activist investor kind of backed off. It was good, but a huge part of what he has to decide to do is with ESPN and Hulu. They're both technically profitable, right? But they are huge burdens of debt. And with Hulu, it gets a little bit more complicated. Well, a lot more complicated because they own 2/3 of it, but then their rival Comcast owns the other third. So the way decisions are made and how that all works is just wild. It holds them back in a lot of ways. This article talks about how they wanted to have a big push to go global, but that was shut down. So they're just in the US domestically, and there's a lot of competition domestically, and they kind of missed the boat to go global given the pandemic and kind of how things have changed. So you've got this behemoth here where in 10 months' time, either side, similar to what the UFC had set up with KKR and Silver Lake, right, is anyone in 2024 can force a transaction where they can say, nope, I'm going to sell the rest of my shares, or I'm going to buy the rest of yours between Disney and Comcast. So Iger has to decide kind of soon what he wants to do with it. He's pretty much said, based on his views, if you read between the lines, some of his quotes, right? I mean, you can tell he's probably leaning towards selling Hulu, but an interesting part of this whole situation is, quote here, that, quote, Iger is stuck, said the chief executive of one large entertainment rival, noting Disney's $48 billion in debt. Hulu is a great service, but it's domestic only, and the US is a very crowded market. So Hulu might have to go, is where it comes through, right? Whereas ESPN, Iger's been a little bit more strong in terms of saying, no, that's something we like. It's not for sale right now. He's outright said in this article, right? Quote, it's going through some obviously challenging times when talking about traditional TV, but we just have to figure out how to monetize it in a disrupting world. We're not engaged in any conversations right now or considering a spinoff of ESPN. And so it's, that makes it sound like, all right, we're keeping ESPN, everything's all good. But then a person close to him said, quote, but ESPN is a declining asset and Disney has a tough balance sheet. Can you invest in ESPN and can you also buy a third of Hulu you don't have? Can you do all these things at a time when the market is saying, hey, I don't want you losing money? Writing on the wall here appears to be Disney's getting out of the Hulu business and focusing more on ESPN. But ESPN is a declining asset, right? Whereas Hulu has the potential to be a little bit more of a Netflix rival. And with that amount of debt, it's a little bit tough. I mean, Iger did say, despite saying they weren't having active conversations about spinning ESPN off, everything is on the table. And that's just, that's something that you have to be careful with reading too much into. But the way I see it, Iger is going to get rid of Hulu. He's going to sell. I can't imagine that doesn't happen. But he's trying to find a way to save ESPN. However, if the numbers don't add up, he's going to have to look at letting ESPN go in some way, shape, or form. And if he does that, right? I mean, a lot of people are saying, how could you let go of it? But I mean, even though it's profitable, it's declining and it's a huge burden on your debt and your costs. And you could then focus in on Marvel and Star Wars, which Marvel's been taking some hits, right? And he's made some changes there creatively. It's okay. We're going to, the decision would be, okay, we're going to let go of these other things we've been involved in to focus more on our core, which is the theme parks, which is the, Disney animation, which is the properties that Disney owns outright. It makes sense to a degree, right? Because ESPN requires deals for content, right? Yes, they can do 30 for 30. Yes, they can do certain shows, but what they are and what they're known for is being the worldwide leader of sports requires that they have to have all these deals with NFL, MLB, UFC, all this stuff, and that requires cost. We know that there have been discussions where Iger essentially was looking at possibly buying UFC outright, decided not to do it because it was too different to the Disney brand. He worried it would kind of hurt the overall brand, and then he regretted it, essentially, is what we've heard. Because now he's paying a ton of money to Endeavor, when if he had that originally, that's a way to bolster ESPN up and help make ESPN Plus an even more viable thing that he would be able to fully control. Now he can't do that. Now he has to pay out a huge sum for media rights. And you've got Ari Emanuel saying, like, look, there's even more buyers now. I expect a huge increase. So all of this paints a certain picture in my mind. And I would love to know if you agree or disagree with this, but here's my analysis, right? Is you've got Ari essentially hinting and pushing at, look, we like working with ESPN. We would love to continue working with ESPN, but there are more buyers out there. I'm not shutting the door on anybody. It's going to come down to what's the best deal we can get. And him essentially being pretty upfront and open about that, right? On the other hand, you have Iger, who is desperately trying to balance some of these deals with Hulu, with ESPN, with his own franchises. And you know, he's staved off the activist investor, but it's clear that investors have kind of shifted to, we want profits. We want to see good financials, spending a lot of money on streaming services that, you know, dip further and further into the black, which was one of the last things that happened with Chapek, is not something investors are going to be happy about. So he's got to navigate a way to cut costs, increase revenue and profit. How does he do that? He can cut Hulu. He can keep ESPN and look for different ways to do that. But a huge thing is going to be, he can't go and pay whatever rights the UFC are asking for just and write a blank check, right? There's too much money on the table and too much money that Disney is already in debt. He can't write a blank check right now, even if he gets rid of Hulu. And, you know, that would help a little bit. But according to the previously agreed guaranteed minimum valuation of Hulu, which Comcast and Disney decided forever ago, that valuation has to be at least $27.5 billion. That, you know, again, is going to cause some friction when it comes time for one of them to sell. Technically, he doesn't have to sell Hulu, but it'd be hard. It'd be extremely hard if he doesn't get out of the Hulu business to make a competitive offer for UFC media rights, because he has to be thinking about the overall company and the balance sheet. If he gets rid of Hulu, he can maybe make a competitive offer, but he can't just give the UFC whatever they want. This isn't a scenario where he's going to go in and say, look, it might be a loss leader for us right now, but it's helping build ESPN Plus up to where we need it to be profitable. So we're going to pay whatever right now just to continue and make sure that our subscriber numbers keep growing and we have that stable base. That has shifted. The macro environment has drastically changed those things. And given where Disney is and what he inherited from Chapek, he can't just go and do that now. So what this tells me is it gives the UFC a possible opening, but also comes with, again, a bigger risk that they highlighted in their 2022 report. Because they said that partnership with ESPN is huge. So they either need to find a buyer who's willing to go way above and beyond just to become the loss leader, to grow their own subscriber base, right? Or somebody that's willing to throw the money at it. Or they're going to not get the media rights deal that they've been planning and hoping for years. Which, again, they're hoping for around double what they got from ESPN the first time. I think it is unlikely they're going to get double given just the timing of this renewal. I feel like things, again, are only going to continue to get worse, whether it's slowly or fast. I can't see us shifting back to the, you know, money tap environment. Everything's going great, you know, venture capital going nuts type of scenario in the next 2 or 3 years. There's at least going to be some cautious optimism in a best case scenario towards that shift, but there's no way we're going to get back to, 2017, 18, 19 levels of just, hey, here's all these startups that are just getting unlimited money, right? We're not going to have more WeWorks, Ubers, Lyft, Pelotons, no, those days are gone for a while, I would imagine. Not forever, but unfortunately for the UFC and Endeavor's media rights deal, I think they're gone for this particular renewal. So the question is, can they find somebody willing to pay that amount? And we've seen, again, they seem to follow the money. So would not be shocked. I mean, you had Apple pay a ridiculous amount of money for MLS rights. Would not be shocked if somebody comes in, Amazon, somebody says, look, I want to be I want to get into this business. I want to get a strong foothold, really boost our subscribership. I'm willing to pay this. I'm willing to be a loss leader on this. And some type of deal gets done. But I don't believe ESPN is going to be that. I think if UFC renews with ESPN, it's not for double the rights they currently have. Could it be 1.5? Maybe. It's going to be an increase for sure. But I don't think they get double their media rights with ESPN. Not the way that things are looking in terms of Disney's balance sheet and Iger's comments. You can read in between some of the lines, right? Of it's a tricky situation. We're trying to do what we can. Clearly, he stands behind ESPN. He wants to keep it around. But part of keeping it alive and keeping it around is also making sure that they're not doubling their costs in terms of media rights for the UFC, right? It's more likely they'll try and pursue different deals with MLB or some of the other bigger sports to kind of force more of those people to go on, right? But yeah, I do not see ESPN giving them what they're talking about wanting right now, what the UFC is talking about wanting right now for UFC media rights. That's my prediction, and that's the picture that I'm seeing painted. Again, let me know if you agree or disagree. I think this stuff is super interesting. I'm very curious to see what Iger does next, given Disney's position. The Q1 call should be fun. So that's coming up, I think, in a month or two. But yeah, it's going to be a very interesting scenario, especially with the way interest rates are going and some of these banking things. I think UFC and ESPN deal might be in trouble, or maybe it's not, and they end up, a lot of these other buyers drop out. But I would imagine UFC is going to be definitely talking to other people for more money than what ESPN can offer. That's my big prediction so far for this media rights deal. We'll see if it holds. And again, let me know your thoughts on it. All right, that wraps up another episode of the Fight Business Podcast. Appreciate you listening. If you're on Anchor, Spotify, Apple, any of that, always appreciate you guys. If you're on YouTube, hit the like, subscribe, bell notification. Appreciate you watching. Again, do have some side projects that I need to kick into high gear again, and I will get back into a weekly routine of this now that I'm, done with COVID, knock on wood. So, yeah, I'll let you guys know. Love you guys as always. And till next time, get money.